Hello everyone, I am Lucky and I am pursuing my integrated MBA in data science and artificial intelligence from IIT Mandi, and I am recording these videos just for the sake of consistency, improving my communication skills and having knowledge in diverse areas by reading books or sharing my experiences. So yesterday was kind of rest day for me. I watched movies and had some rest. And I was feeling like doing the same today also, but I have read somewhere that if we miss 2 days, then it breaks our flow. So one day was yesterday, but I don't want to miss or I don't want to break the flow, so I'm back on my track. And today I'm thinking of reading a different book, that is Critical Thinking by Alec Fisher. This is the book, and there are some questions also in between. So I'll just pause the video and try to write answers of the question and I'll analyze it later. So the first part, or the first chapter, is critical thinking. What is it and how it can be improved? So, there's my pen. In recent years, critical thinking has become something of a buzzword in educational circles for many reasons. Educators have become very interested in teaching thinking skills of various kinds in contrast with teaching information and content. Of course, you can do both, but in past the emphasis is. Here we have question 1.1, that is, we have to tell about what we infer from critical thinking. And at this stage, we have no right or wrong answers. We just have to tell what we think of critical thinking, and we can compare what uh, the book is about to tell us. So I'll be writing my answer now. My response is thinking of any matter consciously and having good understanding of that, spending time in analysis, and then making a decision. So we have some classic definitions from critical thinking tradition. First one is John Davy and reflective thinking. People have been thinking about critical thinking and researching how to teach it for about 100 years. In a way, Socrates began this approach to learning over 2000 years ago, but John Dewey, the American philosopher, psychologist, and educator, is widely regarded as the father of modern critical thinking tradition. Okay, John Dewey is widely regarded as father of modern critical thinking tradition. He called it reflective thinking and defined it as active, persist, persistent, and careful consideration of a belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the ground which support it and the further conclusion to which it tends. Okay, so active, persistent, and careful consideration of a belief. Active, persistent, and careful consideration of a belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of ground which supports it and the further conclusion to which it tends. Let us spend a moment unpacking this definition. By defining critical thinking as an active process, Dewey is contrasting it with the kind of thinking in which you just receive ideas and information from someone else. Okay, by defining critical thinking as an active process, Dave is contrasting it with the kind of thinking in which you just receive ideas and information from someone else. What you might reasonably call a passive process. For Davy, And for everyone who has worked in this tradition subsequently, critical thinking is essentially an active process, one in which you can think things through for yourself, raise questions yourself, find relevant information yourself, and so on. Okay. Rather than learning in a largely passive way from someone else. In defining critical thinking as persistent and careful, Davy is contrasting it with kind of unreflective thinking we all engage in sometimes. For example, when we jump to a conclusion or make a snap decision without thinking about it, sometimes, of course, we have to do this because we need to decide quickly or the issue is not important enough to warrant careful thought. But often we do it when we ought to stop and think, when we ought to persist a bit. However, the most important thing about okay, but we often do it, we ought to stop and think when we ought to persist a bit. However, the most important thing about Davies' definition is that he says about grounds which support a belief and the further conclusion to which it tends. To express this in more familiar language, he's saying that what matters are the reasons why we have uh, okay. What matters are the reasons we have for believing something and the implication of our beliefs. It is no exaggeration to say that critical thinking attaches huge importance to reasoning, to giving reasons and to evaluate reasoning as well as possible. There is more to it than that, but skillful reasoning is a key element. Okay, and we have question 1.2, that is look at passage 57 in the question appendix and applying Davies definition say whether the critical thinking is being exhibited. Try to give reason for your answer. So we have to find passage 57. So in this question, we have to see passage 57 in question appendix, and by applying Davies' definition, we have to say whether critical thinking is being exhibited, and we have to give reasons for that. So let's have a look on passage 57. That is Richard Dawkins. The more you understand evolution, the more you move towards atheism. This is the edited version of Dawkins' speech. Okay, as a Darwinian, something strikes me when I look at religion. Religion shows a pattern of heredity, which I think is similar to genetic heredity. The vast majority of people have an allegiance to one particular religion. There are hundreds of different religious sects, and every religious person is loyal to just one of these. Out of all the sects in the world, we noticed an uncanny coincidence. The overwhelming majority just happened to choose the one their parents belong to, not the sect that has the best evidence in its favor. The best miracles, the best moral code, the best cathedral, the best stained glass, the best music. When it comes to choosing from uh, smorgasbord of available religions, their potential virtues seem to count for nothing compared to matter of heredity. This is an unmistakable fact. Okay, nobody could seriously deny it. Yet people with full knowledge of arbitrary nature of this heredity somehow manage to go on believing in their religion. Often when such fanaticism that they are prepared to murder people who follow a different one. Truths about the cosmos are true all around the new universe. They don't differ in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Poland, or Norway. Yet, we are apparently prepared to accept that the religion we adopted is a matter of accident of geography. If you ask people why they are convinced of the truth of the religion, they don't appeal to heredity. Put like that, it sounds too obviously stupid. nor do they appeal to evidence. There isn't any, and nowadays the better educated admit it. No, they appeal to faith. Faith is the great cop out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, lack of evidence. Okay, there isn't any, okay. No, they appeal to faith. Faith is the great cop out, the great excuse to evaluate the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of even, uh, in spite of even perhaps because of lack of evidence. The worst thing is that the rest of us are supposed to respect it, to treat it with kid gloves. If a slaughterman doesn't comply with the law in respect of cruelty to animals, he is rightly prosecuted and punished. But if he complains that his cruel practices are necessitated by religious faith, we back off apologetically and allow him to get on with it. Any other position that someone takes up can expect to be defended with a reasoned argument. But faith is immune. Faith is allowed not to justify itself by argument. Faith must be respected. And if you don't respect it, you are accused of violating basic human rights. Even those with no faith have been brainwashed into respecting the faith of others. When so called Muslim community leaders go on radio and advocate the killing of Salman Rushdie, they are clearly committing incitement to murder, a crime for which they would ordinarily be prosecuted and probably imprisoned. But are they arrested? They are not, because our secular society respects their faith and sympathizes with the deep hurt and insult to it. Well, I don't. I'll respect your views if you can justify them. But if you justify your views by saying you have faith in them, I shall not respect them. I want to end by returning to science. It is often said that although there is no positive evidence for the existence of God, nor is there evidence against his existence, so it's best to keep an open mind and be agnostic. At first sight, that seem an satiable position, at least in the weak sense of Pascal's vigor, but on second thoughts, it seemed a cop out. Because the same would be said of Father Christmas and tooth fairies. There may be fairies at bottom of garden, but there is no evidence of it. But you can't prove that there aren't any. So shouldn't we be agnostic and respect to fairies? The trouble with the agnostic argument is that we can be applied to anything. There is an infinite number of hypothetical beliefs we could hold which we can't positively disprove. On the whole, people don't believe in most of them, such as fairies, unicorns, dragons, Father Christmas, and so on. But on the whole, they do believe in a creator God, together with whatever particular baggage goes with the religion to their parents. I suspect the reason is that most people, nevertheless, have a residue of feeling that Darwinian evolution isn't quite big enough to explain everything about life. All I can say as a biologist is that the feeling disappears progressively. The more you read about the study, what is known as life and evolution, I want to add one more thing. The more you understand the significance of evolution, the more you are pushed away from agnostic position towards atheism. Complex, statically improbable things are by their nature more difficult to explain than simple, statistically probable things. The great beauty of Darwin's theory of evolution is that it explains how complex, difficult to understand things could have arisen step by plausible step from simple, easy to understand beginning. We start our explanation from almost infinitely simple beginnings, pure hydrogen, and a huge amount of energy. Our scientific Darwinian explanations carry us through a series of well understood gradual steps to all spectacular beauty and complexity of life. The alternative hypothesis, that is, was all started by a supernatural creator and is not only superfluous, is also highly improbable. It falls foul of very argument that was originally put forward in its favor. This is because any god worthy of the name must have been a being of colossal intelligence, a supermind, an entity of enormous sophistication and complexity. In other words, an entity of extremely low statistical probability, a very improbable being. Even if the postulation of such an entity explained anything, and we don't need to do it, and we don't need it to, it still wouldn't help because it raises a bigger mystery than it solves. Science offers us an explanation of how complexity, the difficult, arouses of simplicity, the easy. The hypothesis of God offers no worthwhile explanation for anything, for it simply postulates the difficult to explain and leaves it at that. We cannot prove that there is no God, but we can safely conclude that He is very, very improbable indeed. Okay, so that was para 57, and I think that it is applying Davis' definition as it's active. By active, I mean he's giving various examples, various ideas of why he believes so, and persistent and careful consideration because he is. Wait, we have to do. Okay, he's taking time. He had done some research, and by saying lights of ground which it supports, so he's giving logical arguments and reasoning to what he's saying. So I think that is applying to Davies' definition of critical thinking or reflective thinking. Now we have Edward Glasser building on Davies' ideas. We'll look we'll return to the central role of reasons and reasoning shortly, but let us look briefly on another definition which belongs to critical thinking tradition. This one is due to Edward Glasser, co-author of what has become world's single most widely used test of critical thinking, the Worston-Glasser critical thinking appraisal. Glasser defined critical thinking as an attitude of being disposed to consider in a thoughtful way the problems and subject that come within the range of one's experience, knowledge of the methods of logical inquiry and reasoning, and some skill in applying those methods. Critical thinking calls for a persistent effort to examine any belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of evidence that supports it and further conclusion tends to it. Okay, so Edward Glasser defined it as an attitude of being disposed to consider in a thoughtful way the problems and subject that come within the range of one's experience, knowledge of methods of logical inquiry and reasoning, and some skills in applying those methods. So, first is thoughtful consideration of problem and subject within our experience and having knowledge about the required entity or methods of reasoning and then having the skill to apply those methods. And critical thinking calls for persistent effort to examine any belief or supposed form of knowledge in lights of evidence that supports it and further conclusions to which it tends. It is immediately obvious that this definition owes a lot to Davies' original definition. Glaser refers to evidence in place of grounds because otherwise the second sentence is much the same. The first sentence speaks about attitude or disposition to be thoughtful about problems and recognizes that you can apply what he calls the methods of logical inquiry and reasoning with more or less skill. The tradition has picked up on both these elements. The tradition has picked up on both these elements, recognizing that critical thinking is partly a matter of having certain thinking skills. We'll say which shortly, but it is not just a matter of having these skills. It is also a matter of being disposed to them. Someone might be very skilled at, say, turning somersault, but he might not be disposed to do so. We'll return to these points shortly, but let us have a look to the third definition, that is by Robert Ennis, a widely used definition. One of the most famous contributors to the development of critical thinking tradition in Robert Ennis, his definition, which has gained wide currency in the field, is critical thinking is reasonable, reflective thinking that is focused on deciding what to believe or do. Notice the emphasis on being reasonable and reflective, which picks up on the earlier definitions, but notice also the Ennis speaks on deciding what to do or believe, which was not explicitly mentioned earlier. So, decision making is part of critical thinking in Annie's conception. Unlike Dewey's definition, this definition needs no further explanation because the words are familiar to us. We shall see later that there may be questions about how good a definition is, but it is reasonably clear what Ennis means. Here we have question 1.3. Did you have all those elements in your definition of critical thinking? If so, it is excellent. If you didn't, revise your definition of critical thinking to take account of the tradition as I have just explained it, and write down your new definition of critical thinking as you understand it, preferably using your own words. So I'll be now writing my own definition of critical thinking based on the understanding of these 3-4 pages. So the definition that I have written now is active, reasonable and reflective thinking, focusing on deciding what to believe or what to do. So that was all for today, and I'll continue in further videos. Good night. Jai Hind.